Gold higher, dollar, markets higher, then lower, then higher, then lower. Are the major U.S. indices one big penny stock exchange now? Sugar Daddy Jerome Powell seems to think so. Hertz is bankrupt, but it thinks it can raise $1 billion. I am Gerardo Del Real, along with my co-host, Mr. Nick Hodge. This is episode 74 of Bizarro World. We will be talking gold. We will be talking progress in our society. Go protesters that have been doing it correctly. We'll be talking mortgage rates, NASCAR, all sorts of things. Nick, first and foremost, how are you, sir?
I'm well, Gerardo. Like you, trying to keep pace with this whiplashy market. Volatility is back for sure. We'll talk about it. How are you?
I am well. I am happy to have a voice this happy Friday. As you all know, we record on Friday, publish on Monday. It's been a heck of a week. Frankly, it's been a heck of a year. I was boasting to you off air about the fact that I may get a haircut for the first time in 90 days. The flex is different during a pandemic, right?
If you want to talk about hairdos, we can. So I cut my own hair once because I could moonlight as a werewolf. And so like a month ago, it was just, I was starting to grow wings out of the side of my head. And I told my wife, you know what, I'm just going for it because I had cut some of my roommate's hair in college. And so I just went for it. And it turned out pretty good. But when I first started, because, I keep my hair pretty close. And so I started to fade it up. And it was quite long. So once I took those first couple of strips, I was really into it. And then I was like, oh shit, I guess I got to keep going. Especially in the back, I had some doubts, but it came out pretty good. And of course, Zoom meetings, they only see the front of your head. So it didn't matter what the back looked like anyway. And then, so we've been open for a couple of weeks and I went and got another haircut the other weeks just to even out all my little jackups. And I'm glad you're going to get your hair done because yes, things are a little bit different in a pandemic.
Yeah, and I'm fortunate. My wife's hairstylist, who also cuts my hair, is being kind enough to come to the house and do it here at home. As you know, here in Texas, we reopened a bit over a month ago, and we're now starting to see, and this is something that we should talk about because it has implications for the rest of the country, but we're starting to see not just more cases, which we expected on a net basis, right? Because we're testing more, but we're seeing record hospitalizations now for the fourth day in a row. And we're seeing a record high since we reopened in what they call the positivity rate, but is really just the rate of infection, right? And to provide some perspective, we've seen a 15% spike here in the Austin area just in the past week in hospitalizations. Now, we've been tracking that since the very beginning, and the amount of tests that are happening has increased, but that has zero effect on whether or not you feel sick enough to go to the hospital. So that's worrisome. And the infection rate, we've been lingering between 4 and 5% for a good 3 weeks. And I think since Memorial Day, it trickled up to 6. It flirted with 8%, and is sitting right around that 7 to 8% level. So, Georgia's having a similar situation. Florida's having a similar situation. I don't think it's a coincidence that we saw the volatility come back into the market this week. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, let's before we talk gold and that bull market, and gold did beautifully this week. How's it looking in Spokane? How's it looking in Washington? How's it looking in your neck of the woods, Nick?
Infections are definitely picking back up. And we didn't really have that many to begin with. It was something like a total as of a week ago, 450 or 500 cases. And then sort of as everyone started experiencing a little uptick, an entire factory here, there was 50 or 55 workers all came down with it. So that's a big total when you stack that up against the number of people that had it prior to that point here in Spokane. And so, like you say, you got to keep an eye on the hospitalization rate because testing is one thing, but we got to look at how many people are going to the hospitals. And I was reading about Arizona a week ago. I think that was one of the earliest states to start having a quote unquote second wave, if you want to refer to it as that. And then I guess one thing I would have to throw in there is some of the takes I've been reading are that not really a second wave, that we never really dissipated the first wave entirely. And so a lot of states are in different phases of reopening. Back in Maryland, cities and states are doing it differently. Baltimore is behind the rest of the state. And so I think people got lulled into a sense of complacency, almost sort of like with the stock market, I guess is the point I wanted to make. And now the numbers are starting to tick back up. Like you say, though, we have to see how many people feel sick enough to go to the hospital. So I think that's the important thing to watch now, because if we've learned anything over the past, like you say, what's been a quarter of a year now, is that it affects different people in different ways. And a high infection rate doesn't necessarily mean a shortage of hospital beds, et cetera. And so hopefully we have learned something over the past, 90 or 120 days.
I hope so. It's an interesting contrast that in places like New York, which was the hotbed, right? The epicenter of this, they've been consistently trending lower on all fronts: deaths, infections, net hospitalizations, infection rate. And so I think the one conclusion that we could probably make is that social distancing and taking the precautions absolutely works. And not doing so, is going to contribute to higher amounts of hospitalizations and infections. And, we're going to have to decide as a country and as a society how much we're willing to accept. And it's curious to me, Nick, that we're having a debate about these masks where everybody knows they're effective. Everybody knows, we can see from New York that social distancing in combination with wearing masks when you're out has been effective. And yet it seems like a good portion of America is not even willing to entertain the idea of wearing a mask to protect others. And so, we're gonna reap what we sow on that front. And I just hope that we can all be somewhat logical and practical in our approach moving forward. Doesn't mean you hide in the bunker like the Trumpster. But I think it does mean that, we should not completely let our guard down, which brings us to the markets, right? The markets. Yeah, go ahead.
I can't believe you want us to be logical and practical. I was chuckling.
Can you believe it? Can you believe it? Let's talk about logical and practical or illogical markets and not practical markets. The Dow and the S&P lost 5.5% and 4.7% respectively this week. The volatility index soared for the past several days. The dollar closed higher, closed at 97.22. Gold picked up quietly, almost $50 from the low of 1680 last week to 1731 today where it closed. Silver picked up a little over a dime at 1749. Bottom line is gold was higher, the dollar was higher, the markets were higher than lower than higher, but ended lower for the week. And Sugar Daddy Jerome Powell says at least near zero rates for at least 2 years. What do you make of the madness in the overall indices? And where do you see that trending, Nick? And then we'll talk about gold.
I don't know, Gerardo.
Next.
I mean, look, the market was going up for all the wrong reasons. The stock market I'm talking about, this was sort of our discussion last week. And gold was going up for the right reasons. And it got lulled into complacency. I mean, it really did almost complete. Well, if you're talking about the NASDAQ, it did complete a V and then some. The NASDAQ was back at all-time highs, hit 10,000, and the S&P was seemingly content to march right behind it, and it certainly made up all the ground it had lost in the year, not back to the record highs that it was at in February, but back to where it started the year in January. And then, like you say, for whatever reason, and we can break it down, I guess, because that's what we're here to do, a significant downside in the market this week. Now, the protests didn't do it, and the negative earnings growth didn't do it. And so it was just climbing this wall of worry. And so everyone's now trying to figure out what did it. Was it the second wave of the coronavirus? Was it, Mr. Dines intimated in his letter the accountants getting an early look at coming second quarter numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I have to imagine the numbers aren't going to be good because, we had a solid January and February before things really hit the fan in March, and everyone's sort of been on quote unquote some version of lockdown since then. And so, the market, you would think, and I guess the other narrative that we've now been seeing debated is this sort of armchair trader or Robin Hood trader narrative that are, coming in and buying every dip, including in companies that are going bankrupt and sending up, multi-$100 million market cap companies like Chesapeake Energy up 200% in a day. And so
get some beta, bro. Get some beta.
And the backdrop to all this is that volatility was still high, which no one really ever talks about. Yes, it had come down and the market was seemingly complacent, but it had come down from like historic highs and was still twice the level that it was before coronavirus started. And so against that backdrop of still high volatility, you can get moves up. I think I was writing about this yesterday somewhere. I don't know. I write so fucking much now. I don't know where I write it. But, those big moves, those volatile moves can be up until they aren't, right? And this week they aren't. Except in gold. I mean,
except in gold. And before we get to gold, and this kind of ties into it, I think there's a reason why gold is up and silver is up, and the dollar is also up and volatility's up. I mean, Jerome Powell came out and said, look, you can expect at least near zero rates for at least 2 years. We're not even thinking about raising rates, was the quote that had me just dying off my rocker.
We're not even thinking about.
Yeah, in case there was any gray area, right? And here we are, I just breaking news, Hertz, which is bankrupt and trading, like what it is, a penny stock now, just was approved and authorized by a bankruptcy judge to raise $1 billion. So if anybody out there has any lack of clarity about what the Fed is doing to increase wealth inequality in this country, you go try to get a mortgage loan right now. I have good credit, and they're making me jump through hoops to get, what's now a below 3% mortgage rate. Good first world problem to have. I have hard assets. I have real estate. I'm in the market, obviously. So I'm not complaining on my end. What I am highlighting, though, is that while Hertz can go and raise $1 billion out of bankruptcy on a whim, right? On a good trading week, on a pump and dump, average, everyday Americans that haven't worked for months, for the most part, are having a hard time tapping any equity that they may have in the real estate holdings. And for older Americans that are savers, the Fed is basically saying, fuck you. You are going to get nothing on your money. Don't even thinking about getting a return on your money for the next couple of years. Find it elsewhere. That's the message that has been sent loud and clear by this Fed. And that brings us to gold. And that's why I believe that the deal flow is increasing in the gold space. 2020 has been a year of deal flow. We saw it this week with some mergers, some acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions at inflated prices, right? With Guyana Goldfields and a couple of other names out there. But, I think gold picked up almost $50 in the most quiet of ways, right? It's in here at 1731. I think it closed at 1680 last week. And it didn't seem like gold had a great week, did it?
I mean, not on the whole, but towards the end of the week, I mean, once the market started to go and gold had its big day, it did. But no, before that, no. I mean, like you said, it was below 1700. And so, yeah.
So 1684, I say all that to say there are a lot of opportunities still, though little by little, those opportunities are starting to go away, and there will be new ones. But, we talked about Magna Gold last week a bit, and we talked about it when it was 25 cents, and you and I wrote a check at 10 cents, and we said it last week. You wrote one at 30. I wrote one at 40 again. Here it is trading at some 93, 94 cents, and it's just getting started with executing its business model. Yes, can it go from $1 to $5 in the next 2 to 3 years? Absolutely. But man, if you had allocated some risk capital at the 10-cent level or the 20-cent level, you would be in obviously much better shape to maximize that opportunity. And so I want to get into that a bit, Nick. You had an article that you wrote this week for the Outsider Club division that you founded, of course. And you talked about, the newsletter promotions, and we've all seen them. And I've written in the past, guilty. I've done them, and we highlight those baseline levels that you have to get into in order to be able to reap those, 1,500, 2,000, 3,000% gains. And I feel like that boat is leaving the dock right now, and people better get serious about whether or not they're going to speculate in this gold bull market, because if you come back in 6 months, you're going to have a harder time making those types of returns. Any thoughts on that, Nick?
Oh, I'm sure I have all kinds of thoughts.
You should. You've been booking triple-digit wins left and right. You write 3 newsletters, and each one of those has got multiple triple-digit gains.
Well, it's a gold bull market. Everybody's smart, right? Just go back and look at March, right, and how quickly the gold names snap back from when everyone thought the entire world was going to end. I guess what I would say, and this is a point I've been trying to make, is that these names came back like super strong. Everybody was looking for a V recovery. And while the broad market, finally got there, gold got there fast and then some in big names, like miners, right? And so, yeah, if you look at the charts, if you look at the indexes, GDX and GDXJ, they are now beginning to break out. You're seeing, what do I want to say? I guess new deals coming from old teams, and that's a sure sign that the cycle is beginning anew.
Quality teams, it should be noted. Right?
No, that's exactly what I mean. Well, and of course the non-quality teams will come out too, because the rising tide lifts all ships. But yeah, like Stephen Dean is doing another deal, taking an asset that's already got approval and economics and ready to go into production, essentially in Canada, because the price of gold simply allows that. I was sniffing around it the other day, and I think the economics on that deal. We're done at like $1,300 gold, and so now you're at $1,700 gold, and those projects begin to look a bit better, especially when you've got an operator of that caliber, right? And so I guess to answer your question more directly, yeah, what I was saying is that you see these newsletter promotions, and it's like, oh, the last time gold was doing this, Arequipa Resources and Silver Standard and Pan American and whatever. And it's like those charts that you see, those gains that you were mentioning, this and now and recently is the times that those low prices are quoted from. And I think what we're going to see in the next couple of years is, again, those, the highs that are then quoted in newsletter promotions. And it's not too late. I mean, what do you want to use? The baseball analogy. It's we just had the first inning or whatever. But certainly the cadence is picking up, and the money is moving. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of deals, and I have a service that emails me the press releases of all the tickers that I have on the watch list and in other portfolios. And it's become like a morning routine of an hour-long thing just to like sift through them, right?
I hope that's Resource Stock Digest.
Not that I didn't sift through press releases before, but now the pace is just so wide. Yes, Resource Stock Digest for sure, and the high quality companies there, but ones that aren't featured companies on Resource Stock Digest as well, right? And so it's just a lot happening. Yeah.
A lot happening, and we see that by the M&A activity, right? We see the premiums. We've seen the premiums all year. We're coming out of, bear market PTSD for a lot of people, a lot of traders, a lot of people in the space, newsletter writers included. I remember, October, November, December, where a lot of the better known newsletter writers started getting frustrated and had nothing else to do but bicker amongst themselves. I thought it was hilarious, but I'm sure they didn't find it hilarious, right? That's changed. Everyone's busy. You mentioned how much you're writing. I'm as busy as I've been, at least in 4 years and maybe ever. And so a part of that urgency, though, and the reason that we are as busy and scaling out the way that we're scaling out, is because of the opportunity. This is, I believe, a generational opportunity to make transformative wealth. And you know, whether you're speculating with $10,000, $100,000, $1 million or up, these are the types of markets, everybody, that you suffer the past, you know, what we suffered through the past 3 or 4 years. And frankly, with the exception of a year or two, for most of the last decade. And so the market is here, everyone. It's time to go get in there if you're going to play in this space. And if you're not, nothing wrong with that. It's still high risk. It's still high reward. You still have to deal with a lot of shady characters out there that will take great assets and turn them into a shit company. But again, with a little due diligence and some guidance, you can do spectacularly well in this market.
No, that's it. It's exactly what I wanted to say is the last thing you said there. With a little bit of guidance, you can do spectacularly well. And it has to do with, yes, the leverage that gold stocks provide, and yes, the large gains that can be had, but also like the rolling, and we should talk about warrants maybe too, but the rolling over of gains, right? So you know, you saw me back in February, like before Corona, like starting to sell K92, right? K92 still, I took shit for that. K92 still hasn't gotten back to where it was. And I defended it that day saying it wasn't going to come back to that price for a while. But anyway.
You had crab cakes with your profits, I remember.
That's exactly right. Starting to sell like Taranga this week, for example, 300%, right? And so redeploying immediately though, like right back into Alamos. This is for a newsletter that deals in bigger names, right? Because I think Alamos is like the next Alicer, right? And so if you can roll over a 300% gain and get into another one, and it's still early in the cycle, I mean, that's what you're talking about by a little bit of guidance, right? And so, yeah, it's happening.
Absolutely. And now I'm going to talk our own book, because between the Outsider Club, Resource Stock Digest Publishing, there's frankly just a lot of platforms and options for people to get both paid advice and access to private deals and access to private research and free generalist information if you want that. So if you want free information on companies that we think have compelling stories to tell, go to resourcestockdigest.com. If you want good macro perspectives on everything from pot stocks to gold to tech stocks, you name it, go to outsiderclub.com, where Nick and myself and several other writers write a free editorial once a week, every day, free weekly mailing to your inbox. Or you can go to the website, and then if you decide that you want to invest a bit into some paid research, you can go to the Outsider Club. You can click on the premium publications. I write 2, Nick writes 3, Jimmy Mangle, Jason Simpkins, they write a letter each. And there's a combination of options there that include everything from private placement access for accredited investors to pot stocks, to gold stocks, to, you know, the electrification of everything, critical metal stocks. There's a lot of options. And, you know, it doesn't have to be us, but if you're going to speculate in this space, now is the time to figure out, you know, the jockeys that you want to bet on. And, you know, that can be us. That can be a letter, an excellent letter like Exploration Insights, Joe Mazumdar's letter, and, you know, a letter that Brent used to write exclusively before him and Joe teamed up. There's lots of good options out there, and there's no real wrong answer. You know, I had a wise man tell me once, if I had $10,000, I would take a couple of thousand and spread that out amongst 5 or 6 different newsletter writers and just compare notes. And see who gets what right. And we're all strong in different aspects of our trading and speculative ventures. So, you know, it's a broad palette out there, but you got to get out there and get some if you're going to be listening to us, because if not, you're going to miss out, and you're going to buy in when Magna Gold is $3, upset that you only made 50% when it went, you know, to $4.50, and wondering why you didn't buy in when it was 20 cents or 30 cents. And the answer is going to be because you didn't want to spend a couple of $100 to hear it early, right?
Oh, well, yeah, you nailed it. And it's just like anything else. If you can pull together information and extract the best nuggets, then yeah, getting that information from a diverse source is going to be best. It's like when I'm making a new recipe and I look up 5 different recipes from 5 different sites for the same recipe, and then I just sort of congeal them together. Same thing with these junior mining newsletters for sure. And plenty of opportunities out there.
He makes people money and he cooks everybody. Take that. Listen,
This week I caught the fish, I cleaned the fish, I cooked the fish, and I ate the fish, Gerardo.
Rick Rule would be proud. Rick Rule would be proud. I love it. So speaking of pulling together, I can't help but notice we had a very, very long, in-depth conversation, and we have for months, and frankly, since this podcast has started, about the fourth turning, about the protesters, about the inequality in this country, and about reform. And last week we focused on solutions. And I gotta say, talking about pulling together, the protesters that have protested right, that have done so peacefully, that have organized, I don't know about you. I can't be any prouder of that energy. Again, I'm not talking about the looters. Those are criminals. They have nothing to do with the protests. They're opportunists. Arrest them, put them in prison. I'm talking about the protesters, and change is happening. And I'm going to personalize this and just talk Austin the way I did with the COVID-19 numbers, because I think sometimes when we speak in generalities, it tends to get lost, right? And people don't see real change or real people tied into how, the results of what's happening on a national scale. So here in Austin this week, the city council has now banned chokeholds. That was already in place, but the policy now will outline it in a more detailed way. No more money for beanbags and rubber bullets. We had a couple of issues here where a couple of peaceful protesters were just standing in the general direction of people that were throwing a water bottle, an empty water bottle at that. And police felt the need to shoot into that crowd. And what the dumbasses did is they ended up hitting one gentleman in his early 20s, and he is in critical condition last I checked. And they hit a young lady that was pregnant that, neither one of these people happened to be at the protest. One was getting off of work and one was walking through the area, and she's in the hospital. So, these beanbags, these rubber bullets, all of that, no more funding for that. I can't help but notice that in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was killed, that's the 26-year-old EMT who was sleeping when police decided to execute a no-knock warrant looking for 2 people that were already in custody. They didn't announce their presence. They didn't announce that they were police officers. They simply kicked the door down, went in yelling, and when Miss Taylor's significant other returned fire, they shot 22 times, hit her 8 times, and then that's that. That's illegal now. That's no longer allowed in Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm hoping it's something that is federally enforced. There's several politicians that are now challenging the Qualified Immunity Act. And for those of you that aren't familiar, I'll put a link up. But basically, qualified immunity is what we talked about last week, where police officers and prosecutors and other members of our government, the same government that exists because of us, because we fund it, they're allowed to basically abuse their authority and power without any type of repercussions, any type of legal repercussions. There's a big push right now that people like Tom Brady, even Drew Brees is on board, Steve Kerr of the Golden State Warriors, a lot of celebrities with a lot of influence and a lot of politicians that have really organized well during these protests. They're pushing to get that passed on a national level. I say all that to say, for all of the doubters that were skeptical about the stick-to-itiveness of these protesters and thought it was a couple of day thing, I got news for you. It's going on 20 days now, and it's not stopping anytime soon. And this is absolutely the time to push for real reforms. Real reforms. There's a law in New York that just got repealed. New York, one of the most corrupt unions in the country, and I dare say one of the most corrupt police departments in the country. And that's no shade to the good officers there, but we're talking about the bad ones right now. They just passed a law that allows for taxpayers to see the public record of an officer that has been accused of misconduct. Believe it or not, that was not something that existed which allows a lot of the bad apples, quote unquote, to hide. So little by little, I am seeing a trend, Nick, that encourages me, that shows more transparency. It is early in this, and we're going to have to keep on it. But I got to say, I haven't felt as encouraged as I have this week. One last note, and then I'll stop, I promise. It's odd that once the cops decided to de-escalate on a national scale, you're not seeing any more of the bullshit that everybody was pointing at, like the looters, like the rioters. It's almost as if the protesters always wanted to protest peacefully, and the people that were kicking shit up were a lot of the officers. Interesting how that turned, huh?
I mean, and we saw it in real time, and that's why it was different. I mean, and even so, they tried to lie about it. We touched on that again last week. And, there's really been a shift in people's attitudes and awareness with this social media and real-time video. And, as it's been called, everybody making documentary films in real time. And so I'm not going to go through the changes that I've seen. There have been a lot. There is a lot more to come. It's good to see people on board, including Mr. Breeze. It would be nice if Mr. Kaepernick had a job. That's maybe a topic for another time. But you mentioned the fourth turning, and even the fourth turning is getting its moment in the spotlight. The New York Times had an article about the authors of the book this week, pointing to, basically its propheticness. And I've seen other people writing articles about the fourth turning and how it basically predicted and explains the things that are going on in the country today. And so it's always good when you see the head of the crowd and they start to see in line with you.
I will say that according to that book, we're only halfway through. And so that's worth noting when people believe that this generation, this group of fighters for change is going to be tired out or fatigued. Not according to the book, not according to past cycles, not according to the level of activity that I'm seeing on all fronts. We're probably about halfway in, and I expect the rest of the decade to be one that's transformative globally, but especially in this country. And man, does it need it, because we still can't fucking hold a primary election in this country without machines not working, people standing in line for 6-7 hours at a time. And man, if that doesn't change.
Yeah, well, it's certainly not going to come to an end unless by something really, really miraculous we get another candidate in there for the presidency this year. Then you likely don't see a conclusion until post 2024. And so, if you want like a little bit of cliff notes, what has to happen is that, old institutions have to be torn down and the nation has to, quote unquote, rebuild itself in a new form or in a new ideal. And it will coalesce around a politician. It doesn't necessarily have to be Republican. It doesn't necessarily have to be Democrat. It could be something you never even heard of before, just like you never heard of coronavirus in January. It could be some new party that pops up because weird stuff like that happens in fourth turnings. But at any rate, there needs to be like an FDR Churchill type situation. And I don't think it's Biden or Trump.
I agree. And let's talk about Georgia a bit more, because man, it set me off, Nick. Our democracy is emboldened when everybody has a voice. And man, are these motherfuckers making it hard. And let me be clear. The governor of Georgia is a Republican. The local officials are Democratic. Both sides are to blame. It's a damn embarrassment what happened in Georgia this past week. I'll put a link up, but voting machines that are broken, running out of ballots, having people during a pandemic stand outside for 6-7 hours at a time into the night to register a vote is an embarrassment. I can wire money to a Canadian bank from my office in Round Rock, Texas, from my computer in less than 5 minutes. In less than 5 minutes. I can deposit a check with my phone and have it processed the same day. We can't figure out how to register a vote in this country. And again, if this is what we're going to see during the primary election, and it happens to coincide with whatever you want to call it, a second wave of COVID or a continuation or an escalation of the first wave, and you throw that in with some of the leadership that we have in place, expect more volatility. And for those of you out there that are still complaining about NASCAR banning Confederate flags, or complaining about, I had a guy retire who's never won a race in 32 races, and somehow that was supposed to be consequential. For those of you that are complaining about that, I don't see you up in arms about Americans not being able to cast a vote in this country. I don't see the same reaction. I don't see the same rage. It's interesting, huh?
Got a couple of things I want to say there. I'm just taking notes so I get it all. One is that you see a lot of just absolute garbage, right? Like what was the thing this week? Like we're trying to defund Paw Patrol or something. And then people like latch onto this, like, and try to make it like indicative of the movement. Like, see, they're trying to even take away kids' cartoons that have dog police in them or something. And then the argument is just like they try to skew it so far to one way. And that's really sort of where we've been. Like, that's like the intense complexity that you and I have talked about, how, things seem so convoluted and like, it's so complex that there are no good answers. And, there's a quote, I think I've talked about it here before, it's like out of intense complexity, intense simplicity arises. And it's like, of course you probably, or of course you shouldn't have a Confederate flag, that supported, slavery and fought to keep that the status quo. Etc. That's
and
like,
they lost. They lost.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't make the fucking rules when you lose.
Right. It's intensely simple, and so I think we're coming into more of those intensely simple solutions where we don't have to hem and haw about things because they're pretty cut and dried. And online voting is certainly one of those things that is intensely simple for the reasons you said. We already do things that are much more sensitive online with our personal and financial data. And so, what I would say is that the reason they don't want you to have online voting is because it opens the door closer to direct democracy. Which we should have more of, where you have people voting directly on the issues themselves. And it's definitely a control thing, and it goes back to, redlining and districts and all the bullshit that you just talked about, not having enough ballots and making people wait in line and other backhanded suppression techniques. And so I think there'll just come a point where, it's so intensely simple that it will just happen. I mean, there's no reason why we can't vote online. I vote for, like you say, directors of companies and public company votes, etc. And so it's time.
And it's important, everybody, to stay focused and hold people accountable. For the past 3 weeks since the protests started, all I've heard is about the big bad Antifa boogeyman. And I'm going to give you another local example. One I wrote to my news outlet, my favorite news outlet, KView News here in Round Rock in the Austin area. We've heard that Antifa is, it's violent. Donald Trump got out there and tweeted, empty fucking tweet as always, right? I'm designating it a terrorist organization, and everybody in the administration looked around like, we can't do that, but okay, buddy. Anyhow, I've been waiting. I've wanted to know, I don't like the boogeyman any more than the next person. So I've waited. How many people did these Antifa people kill? What did they how much did they steal? How many people did they brutalize? And so here in the Austin area, I get an article about a week ago that says, as a result of an investigation between local officials and the FBI, 3 Antifa members were arrested. Cool headline. So then I dig into it and follow up. And what it turns out it was 3 kids in their late teens and early 20s that had stolen $20,000 in goods from the local Target. And then I followed up by asking, well, how much money was spent on this investigation that yielded some shoplifters? And I can't get an answer out of anybody, right? And then all of a sudden I start getting, all sorts of FBI ads on my Twitter feed, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. But again, for 3 weeks, we've been told that the enemy and the people we really got to watch out for are Antifa. Yet the people that are running over police officers tend to come from a certain side. The people that are out there committing all the stupid bullshit that you see on videos left and right, a lot of the bigoted and the racist stuff tend to be on one side. So again, it seems like the Antifa boogeyman has gone away now. And I'm here to tell you it went away because does the organization exist as a loose-knit group of counterculture people that have certain beliefs? Absolutely. But does it exist in the way that the government and the media has portrayed them as a convenient boogeyman that was the cause of all bad rioting and looting and violence and all of this other stuff? No, there hasn't been a police officer killed by Antifa. There hasn't been, a police officer stomped out by a gang of Antifan people, whatever the heck they call themselves or people want to call them. So just pay attention to the bullshit we're fed, everybody. And again, hold those people accountable. Hold your local news stations accountable for the stuff they put on there. Hold your local politicians accountable when they tell you stuff that later on doesn't make any sense and turns out to be an outright lie, like the Minnesota Police Department saying the 75-year-old man tripped and fell when we clearly saw he was pushed.
Well, it's much easier to believe a big lie for some people than to admit what's really going on. And it's done quite easily, Gerardo. I mean, clearly, Nazis and Jews are one famous example, but we've had them here in the United States with Salem witch trials and, with McCarthy in the 60s, et cetera. It's very easily to convince people of not only that there is a boogeyman, but to go on a witch hunt for that boogeyman. And it's that witch hunt part that turns into potentially very dangerous situations. I told you last week here in Spokane, they were immediately blaming the initial unrest on out-of-town agitators, and then when the arrest records came out, there was nobody from out of town. And so, one more story to keep it local is there was a multiracial family here from Spokane. A mother, a father, his mother, and their child went camping on the west side of the state in their camper here from Spokane, and they went to pick up some groceries in a grocery store before they hit the campsite. And when they came out of the grocery store, their car was encircled by what you could only categorize as, a far-right group or a far-right militia with AR-15s and other weapons, insisting that they were Antifa and that they were in their camper, on the move from like protest to protest, right? With no evidence for this whatsoever other than the Phantom Boogeyman story, right? And so it gets more crazy because not only did they encircle him in the parking lot of the grocery store, but when they were finally able to leave and head to the campsite, this far-right group followed them there and cut down trees, blocking them in the campsite so they couldn't leave, like fell trees across the road. And so that's like pure deliverance stuff. I mean, how intimidating is that if you got guys with guns cutting down trees, blocking you in a campsite when you're with your family? And that is precisely the dog whistle stuff that you talk about, Gerardo, that incites people to act that way, right? And so, who's the agitator there? One more local story. I told you how peaceful the protests were here in Spokane on Sunday. No violence, nobody out of order, despite massive crowds, 5,000 to 6,000. people. And of course, at the end of the march, there was a guy there, right, in his vest and his thigh holster and his AR-15. And they say they're there to keep the order, but there's nobody out of order. They just want to be there for the same reason that people wanted to bring their AR-15s to the steps of the State House in Michigan a couple of weeks ago. And so, it's that dog whistle, and it's that keep the people divided. Make sure there's a boogeyman that no one can put their finger on to keep them running around in circles. And that's how, you said it earlier this week on Twitter. I think that's the game plan, right? Tear down a couple of statues, claim a victory lap, and then hope everybody forgets. And that's that's how the march of tyranny continues, is that obfuscation and that continued divisiveness and that pointing to things that don't exist.
Agreed. And here I am, right? I couldn't help but notice that the last couple of days, the Trump administration now is blaming or looking to frame, it'll be out this week, I'm sure, is looking to frame, the spike in hospitalizations and COVID-19 cases in places like Arizona and Texas and in places that opened early on my group, on Mexicans. Now it's the legal migration that we allowed. It wasn't the spring breakers that were out at Corpus Christi and South Padre Island, having a fucking blast. It wasn't the Arizona spring breaker kids that were out there having a fucking blast. It wasn't, the people getting their hair cut saying that, the light and their Lord would go ahead and take care of the COVID. They don't have anything to worry about. They're not wearing masks. It wasn't the people congregating at the church, hundreds at a time without masks. It wasn't any of those people, just the Mexicans. Pay attention, people. Pay attention. Call bullshit when you see it, no matter who is saying it. It's the only way we continue forward in a way that is productive and healthy. Everybody complains about the protests. Can you imagine if we wanted revenge?
There's a lot of bullshit out there. Like I said about the Paw Patrol, and there's other examples of just, taking the argument to the extreme and setting up a straw man. And you're right. No, you got to keep calling it out. It's definitely time. That's what the fourth turning is about. It's about, coming of age and calling out the status quo and making sure others realize. So I'm all about it.
I like it. Let's give some people some money-making ideas, Nick. And again, we don't rehearse any of this stuff. We put up some talking points on a shared document sometimes. Sometimes we just don't put anything up and freestyle it. Today's kind of one of those days where we just kind of talk about things that are on our mind. As usual, there's always a couple of talking points, but not many. Anyhow, any names to watch in the coming weeks, Nick? Opportunities that you still see in the market that haven't been recognized by the people in the know, or the people that aren't in the know, frankly, the retail side of it that doesn't pay as much attention to the market as we do?
Well, one, I'm looking forward to some results from Millrock Resources. They started drilling again in May, and the market was really excited about that initial campaign that was cut short, and they only got to release results
1.5 hole
and a partial hole. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to getting that going again. What else am I excied about? I have.
What's better than 1.5 holes, Nick?
What's that?
2.
Well, I can't.
They finished the second hole, which is great.
I can't wait. Would love to get that whole second hole. Now you made me lose my train of thought. Oh, I don't think I've talked about ImmunoPrecise on this podcast, and I gotta say,
IPA, yes.
This stock has been on an absolute tear. Was able to finance it in Nick's notebook at 30 cents, and it's always been a good team. It's why people are so important, and they've had unique ways to generate and research antibodies. And since the COVID thing happened, this company, ImmunoPrecise Antibodies, it's called, has been trying to come up with an antibody to fight COVID. And they do this by taking antibodies from mice and rats and rabbits and then using computational analysis to, find different molecular structures on those antibodies that line up with proteins on the disease's DNA. So it all gets very scientific very fast, but everybody's seen the picture of that like COVID blob with all the spikes on it. All the different spikes are like different proteins, and the biggest spike is the spike protein. And that's the one that transmits the disease. And so if you can sort of neutralize that big spike protein on the blob of the COVID picture that everybody has seen, you can stop the spread of it. And through their research platform, they found an antibody that does just that, neutralizes that spike protein. And so the stock has gone to essentially $2, pulled back a little bit to maybe $1.70 today. But this is like multi-billion-dollar cure stuff. So the next step in the process is to learn exactly why their antibody stops this spike protein. And then once they learn why it's neutralizing it, from there they can begin to turn it into a therapy. And some very big players are involved, as you can imagine, wanting to know why they can neutralize the COVID protein. And so the ticker is IPA in Canada, and we're not buying it anymore. But if this pans out the way I think it does, that $2 stock becomes a $5 or $6 or $10 stock very, very quickly.
One of the prettiest charts you will see in 2 quarters. Go January, February, March, all the way up till today, June the 12th. And man, it is a thing of absolute beauty. So congrats to you and subscribers. Hey, yeah.
It's even more beautiful if you owned it before it was called ImmunoPrecise, when it was, and I might have to get this framed, Tanker Ray Exploration, baby.
Take a victory lap.
I've got to do it on this one, boy.
I like it. So I'm going to talk my book real quick. There is a company that I have done very well with in the past, a company that I've owned on and off for over a decade, and a company that has been left for dead by the market. Has a market cap of approximately $2.2 million Canadian. Is doing a small financing. I'm writing a check. I believe Nick is writing a check. Is that correct, Nick? I know you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, I am.
So we're both writing a check, doing a $210,000 private placement. The company's name is Nevada Sunrise Gold. Quick bullet points. It owns water rights that have some debt attached to those water rights. We can dispute the value of those water rights. I could make a pretty decent argument that the water rights alone are worth the market cap. But for the sake of this argument, let's assume that the water rights are only worth the amount of debt attached to those water rights that accrued as a result of lawyers' fees and disputing with the state for years on end. That was resolved favorably in Nevada Sunrise's favor. And I believe that there is a path forward in negotiating either a sale or a removal of the debt that's attached to that. So why Nevada Sunrise and why now? Because it owns 20% of a Nevada project called Kinsley Mountain. Kinsley Mountain, as I said, is in Nevada. It has had some spectacular numbers in the past. That 20%, I can make a very compelling argument, is worth a lot more than $2 million. The best argument I can make to you is that New Placer Dome Gold, formerly Berrien Mining, who we've talked about in the past, owns 80% of it now. They purchased it from Liberty Gold, and they are drilling that pretty aggressively starting in mid-July. The initial program is going to be 20,000 meters, 15,000 RC, 5,000 of diamond drilling. I will speculate that one of two things happens. Either they hit and they buy it at a much higher price than today's 4.5 cent, 5 cent share price that Nevada Sunrise is boasting, or they buy it beforehand in the next month or two in order to control it. And I can tell you that as a relatively large shareholder and me knowing some of the other larger shareholders, it's going to be at multiples of today's price. And that may present an opportunity for the retail crowd amongst you. There is a secondary asset, the Coronado project, which is a copper VMS asset, also in Nevada, that provides you a backup and some cover there if Kinsley doesn't work out. But again, 20,000 meter drill program is pretty aggressive. It's great to own 20% of that. And I, for one, have been waiting for years to see that property properly drill tested. And we're finally going to get that. So ticker symbol NEV on the exchange, the Canadian exchange.
That's what I'm talking about with these newsletter promotions. You can totally picture one where, there's a chart of Nevada Sunrise starting at 2.5 cents, right?
Absolutely. And going to 30, 40, 50 or $1. And again, hey, if it just goes to 15 and 20 cents and that's all you did, it's 5 times today's level, people. And again, the catalyst is years away. The catalyst is, drilling starts in mid-July, and the market being forward thinking, I'll be interested to see what Berrien does and how it plays its cards. And, obviously wishing them success on that drill program because, we're kind of joined at the hip at this point, right?
It's New Placer Dome, Gerardo.
New Placer Dome Gold. Yes, I stand corrected. That'll take a little bit of getting used to, but if they hit, I'll call them whatever they want me to call them, as long as it's appropriate. Nick, anything else on your end? Do you have a feel-good story? Do you have something to make us smile going into the weekend?
Well, I gave you just a feel-good story about potentially an antibody that is going to stop COVID, but off the top of my head, no. I mean, we're in a fourth turning. We're in a gold bull market. We are starting to get police reform. I know it's a bit crazy. We're still in lockdown, but I guess my positive story is just, staying upbeat through it all. And certainly this weekly therapy session helps. But if you can do a little bit of good, and if you can make a little bit of jingle, and if you got your health and your family, then you're doing all right.
Keep good health, everybody. Keep family around. If you're fortunate enough to have family around you, reach out to people that may not be doing as well or as stable as you are. If you happen to be in the fortunate position to be doing well and to be stable and to be making it through these, incredibly challenging times that we're all facing. That is it. That's all I got. I am Gerardo Del Real, along with Mr. Nick Hodge. This was episode 74 of Bizarro World. Say goodbye, Nick.
See ya.